The card landed on Grace's tray with a soft click, and her whole body went still. No name, no table number, just 5 words in gold ink: "Come outside, now alone." She looked up, and the entire diner seemed to hold its breath with her. Every man in a black suit had stopped chewing. Forks hovered midair. And the one they called Mr. Song, the man who never looked at anyone twice, was standing now, staring at her like he'd seen something rise from the dead. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Where did you get that necklace?" Grace's fingers flew to her throat before she even thought to move them. It was the only thing her mother had left behind, all those years ago, before she vanished without a single word. "That necklace," Song said, and his voice cracked just slightly, just enough for her to hear it, "belonged to a woman who's supposed to be dead." "My dead woman." Behind him, 2 men reached quietly into their jackets. Grace didn't know it yet, but she had just become the most protected and the most hunted woman in the entire city. "Before we go further, tell me quickly in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I want to see how far the story travels." Now, let's go back 3 days, to where all of this actually began. Grace Whitfield had learned a long time ago that tired wasn't a feeling anymore. It was just who she was. She moved through her shift at Rosalie's diner like a woman running on memory alone, refilling coffee cups, wiping down tables, smiling at strangers even when her feet screamed with every step. "Table 6 needs their check, baby," said Miss Odessa, the older waitress who'd been working there since before Grace was born. She touched Grace's arm gently. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," Grace admitted, forcing a small laugh. "Kofi had a rough night. Fever wouldn't break till almost 4. Miss Odessa's face softened with worry. "Is he better?" "A little. I called the clinic this morning, but—" Grace's voice trailed off, and she busied her hands with wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean. She didn't want to say the rest out loud. That the clinic wanted more tests. That the tests cost money she didn't have. That her son's cough had started sounding wrong in a way that made her chest tighten every time she heard it. "You let me know if you need anything," Miss Odessa said, and squeezed her hand before walking off. Grace nodded, blinking fast, because if she let herself feel it right now, in the middle of a Tuesday lunch rush, she wasn't sure she'd be able to stop. That was when the door chimed, and 3 men in dark suits walked in like the air itself had shifted around them. The diner didn't get men like that. Rosalie's was a corner spot, worn booths, cracked vinyl seats, the kind of place regulars loved because nobody ever tried to impress anybody. But the man who walked in last, the one the other 2 seemed to orbit around without even trying, looked like he belonged somewhere far more expensive than this. He was tall, sharp-jawed, dressed in black from head to toe, and there was something in the way he moved, careful, unhurried, like a man used to being watched and having learned to give nothing away. "Sit anywhere you like," Grace called out automatically, grabbing 3 menus. He didn't answer. He just chose the booth in the far corner, the one facing the door, and sat down like he'd done it 1,000 times in 1,000 different rooms. Grace approached with the menus, plastering on her work smile. "Afternoon. Can I start you gentlemen off with something to drink?" The 2 men on either side glanced at their boss first, waiting. He hadn't even looked at the menu. "Water," he said. His eyes lifted to hers for the first time. And then something strange happened. He stopped. His gaze dropped, just for a second, to the small gold necklace resting against her collarbone, the one with the tiny cracked pendant her mother had given her the day before she disappeared. Grace was so used to wearing it she barely noticed it herself anymore. But he was looking at it like it had spoken his name. "Sir?" Grace asked when the silence stretched a beat too long. He blinked, and whatever had crossed his face vanished behind a wall so fast she almost thought she'd imagined it. "Water's fine," he said again, quieter this time. "For all of us." Grace nodded and walked away, feeling his eyes on her back the entire way to the counter. Her skin prickled with something she couldn't name. Not fear exactly. Something stranger. Like being recognized by a stranger who had no right to recognize her at all. "Who are they?" she whispered to Miss Odessa, pouring 3 glasses of water with hands that weren't quite steady. Miss Odessa glanced over her shoulder and her face changed instantly. the easy warmth draining into something careful. Baby, you don't want to know. Odessa. That's Taemin's song, she said, voice barely above a breath. People round here just call him Mr. Song. You don't ask him questions. You don't linger at his table. You bring the food, you smile, and you let the man be. Is he dangerous? Miss Odessa gave her a look that answered the question better than words could. Grace carried the tray back over, careful, composed, setting each glass down without meeting his eyes. But she felt him watching her the entire time, and when she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. Wait. She turned back slowly. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment, studying her face like he was trying to solve something. That necklace, he said. Where did you get it? Grace's hand rose instinctively to touch it. It was my mother's, she said carefully. She gave it to me when I was a little girl. Why? Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. No reason, he said. It's beautiful. That's all. But his jaw was tight, and his knuckles had gone pale around the glass of water he hadn't touched, and Grace walked away with her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain, feeling like she'd just stepped into the middle of a story that had started long before she was born. She didn't know his name would be haunting her by nightfall. She didn't know that 3 days from now, a black card would land on her tray and change absolutely everything. And she certainly didn't know that somewhere across town, an old woman named Sukja was about to look at a photograph she hadn't touched in 20 years and whisper a name she thought she'd buried forever. If you're already feeling this one in your chest, drop a like and hit subscribe, because trust me, it only gets heavier from here. Let's continue. Grace clocked out a little after 7 that evening, her feet aching, her mind still tangled around the strange man in the black suit and the way he'd looked at her mother's necklace like it owed him something. She found Kofi curled up on the couch when she got home, wrapped in the blanket her sister had sent from Atlanta 2 Christmases ago, his small body shivering even under the thick fabric. Hey, baby, she whispered, kneeling beside him and pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. Too warm. Still too warm. Mama, he mumbled, eyes fluttering open. You smell like pancakes. She laughed softly, even though her chest ached. That's the diner smell. Sorry, love. I like it. She smiled and kissed his forehead, but underneath the smile, panic was quietly clawing its way up her throat. The fever had been dropping and rising for 3 days now, never fully breaking, and the cough at night had started sounding deeper, wetter, wrong in a way that made her stomach twist. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from the clinic. Additional testing required. Estimated cost attached. Grace read the number twice, then a third time, as if it might change if she looked hard enough. It didn't. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry, quietly, so Kofi wouldn't hear. The next day, the black suits came back. Same booth. Same 3 men. And Grace, against every instinct telling her to keep her distance, found herself watching Taemin's song from across the room more than she wanted to admit. You're staring, Miss Odessa murmured, passing behind her with a tray of plates. I'm not staring, Grace said quickly. I'm working. When she finally approached the table to take their order, Song looked up at her with an expression that had softened just slightly from the day before, like he'd spent the night thinking about something and hadn't quite finished. You look tired, he said. Grace blinked, caught off guard. Customers didn't usually notice things like that. Customers didn't usually notice her at all. I'm fine, sir. What can I get you? The usual, he said, though he hadn't ordered anything the day before that could be called usual. Then, quieter, almost like he wasn't sure he meant to say it out loud, is your son all right? Grace froze. How do you know I have a son? Something like embarrassment flickered across his face, quick and unfamiliar on a man who looked like he rarely felt anything at all. Odessa mentioned it, he said. I wasn't trying to pry. I noticed you seemed worried yesterday. Grace didn't know whether to be touched or unsettled. Maybe both. He's sick, she admitted, because something in his voice made it hard to lie. The doctors want more tests. I'm still figuring out how to pay for them. Song nodded slowly, and something behind his eyes went very still, very focused, like a decision was being made that she wasn't part of. "I hope he feels better," he said simply, and let her go. That night, when Grace counted her tips at the register, she found an envelope tucked beneath the folded bills. No name, no note. Just cash, more of it than she had ever held in her life at once. Her hands shook as she counted it twice. $50,000. She looked up at the empty diner, heart pounding, and knew without needing proof exactly where it had come from. The next morning, she marched into the diner before her shift even started, envelope clutched tightly in her hand, and found him already there, same booth, same quiet watchfulness. "I can't take this," she said, setting it down in front of him. Song looked at the envelope, then at her, unreadable. "Why not?" "Because I don't know you," Grace said, voice trembling with something between anger and desperation. "Because men like you don't just give money to women like me for nothing. What do you want?" For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then, quietly, "I don't want anything from you, Grace." Her breath caught. "I never told you my name." Something crossed his face then, fast and involuntary, guilt maybe, or grief, or both tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them. "It's on your name tag," he said, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers when he said it. Grace stared at him a long moment, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath her, like there was a conversation happening underneath the one they were actually having, one she wasn't allowed into yet. "Take the money," Song said, low and steady. "Get your son the care he needs. Please." The word please seemed to cost him something. Grace could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, like he wasn't a man who asked for things, only gave orders. She wanted to refuse again. Every instinct told her to. But then she thought of Kofi's small shivering body on the couch, the cough that sounded wrong, the fear that had been sitting in her chest for days like a stone she couldn't swallow or spit out. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Song's jaw tightened. His eyes drifted, just briefly, to the necklace at her throat. "Someday," he said quietly, "I'll tell you. Just not today." He stood, left cash on the table for a meal he barely touched, and walked out into the gray afternoon light, leaving Grace standing there with an envelope of money and 100 new questions she had no way of answering. She didn't know that 2 days from now, her son would collapse at school. She didn't know an old woman named Sukja was already on her way across town with a torn photograph clutched in her trembling hands. And she didn't know that the black card, the one that would change everything, was already being written. If your heart is racing a little right now, that's exactly where I want it. Drop a comment telling me what you think Taemin is hiding, and hit that subscribe button, because part 3 is about to change everything you think you understand about this story. Let's keep going. Kofi collapsed at school 2 mornings later, right in the middle of morning assembly, and by the time Grace got the call, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone to her ear. "Ma'am, your son is stable," the nurse said gently, "but we need you here right away." Grace didn't remember the drive to the hospital. She only remembered running through the sliding doors, her uniform still smelling like coffee and bacon grease, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt to breathe. "Where is he?" she gasped at the front desk. "Kofi Whitfield, where is my son?" A nurse led her down the hallway, and Grace's knees nearly buckled with relief when she saw him, small and pale in a hospital bed, an oxygen tube resting under his nose, but awake, blinking up at her. "Mama," he whispered. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." She pressed her lips to his forehead, tears falling freely now, no longer caring who saw. The doctor came in a few minutes later with a clipboard and a careful expression, the kind doctors wore when they were about to say something heavy. "His infection is more serious than we initially thought. He needs surgery, and soon. I understand you were already looking into financing, so I want you to know, someone has already covered the procedure in full." Grace's head snapped up. "What? Who?" "The account came through anonymously this morning," the doctor said. "Everything's taken care of." Grace stood there in stunned silence, and she didn't need anyone to tell her whose hands had made that call. She found him 20 minutes later, standing quietly near the elevators, hands in his pockets, like he'd been waiting for her without wanting to be seen waiting. Why do you keep doing this, she said, voice cracking. Why do you keep showing up for us? Song's eyes were soft in a way she hadn't seen before, something old and tired and aching just beneath the surface. Because I made a promise a long time ago, he said quietly. To someone I loved very much. I intend to keep it. To who? He hesitated, and for a moment Grace thought he might finally tell her everything. But instead he simply said, Your son is going to be all right, Grace. That's what matters tonight. She wanted to push further, but exhaustion and relief were pulling her under, and she let it go for now. What she didn't see, what she couldn't have known, was the elderly woman sitting in a car in the hospital parking lot, watching the exchange through the window with tears streaming down her weathered face. Halmoni Sukja had come to bring her grandson dinner, the way she always did when he skipped meals for days at a time worrying over business she didn't fully understand. But the moment she saw Grace's face beneath the hospital lights, illuminated clearly for just a few seconds, the container of food slipped straight from her hands. It can't be, she whispered, pressing a trembling palm against the car window. Those eyes. Sunhee's eyes. She reached into her purse with shaking fingers and pulled out an old photograph, worn soft at the edges from 20 years of being held, put away, and held again. A young woman smiled up from the image, standing beside a teenage Taemin, laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in faded ink, only a fragment of handwriting remained, the rest torn away long ago. Forgive me. Protect her daughter. Halmoni's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He doesn't know, she whispered to herself. He truly doesn't know who she is. Her chest tightened with the weight of 2 decades of silence, and before she could stop herself, the photograph slipped from her fingers and her vision blurred at the edges. The last thing she remembered was reaching for the door handle before everything went dark. 3 days later, Grace stood in Rosalie's diner, her tray balanced on one hand, when a black car pulled up outside and a stranger walked in and slid a small black card onto her tray without a word. No name, no number, just 5 words written in gold ink. Come outside. Now. Alone. Her hand trembled as she read it again, and when she looked up, the entire diner had gone quiet, every man in a black suit frozen mid-motion, and Taemin Song rising slowly from his seat, staring at her like he'd seen a ghost rise from the grave. Say that again, he whispered. Where did you get that necklace? Grace's fingers flew to her throat, the same question she'd been asked before, but this time his voice was different, cracked open with something far bigger than curiosity. That necklace, he said, belonged to a woman who's supposed to be dead. My dead woman. And somewhere across the city, in a hospital room she didn't yet know existed, an old woman was waking up with a torn photograph clutched to her chest, whispering a name that would soon change Grace Whitfield's entire understanding of who she was, where she came from, and why a Mafia king had looked at a poor waitress and simply could not walk away. What Grace would learn in the days that followed was that love, real love, doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in an envelope of cash, in a paid hospital bill, in a promise kept across 20 long years of silence and grief. Sometimes the people meant to protect us come from the places we least expect, and the family we're searching for has been searching for us just as hard, just as long. What do you think Taemin's real connection to Grace's mother truly is? Tell me your theory in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story pulled at your heart tonight, there's another one waiting for you on this channel that I promise will hit just as deep. Go watch it next, and I'll see you there. A knock came at the door 3 days later, soft, hesitant, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who wasn't sure they were welcome. Halmoni was home from the hospital by then, resting in the small sunlit house she shared with Song when he wasn't traveling for business. Grace had been staying close, helping where she could, still trying to make sense of a truth that had rearranged everything she thought she knew about her own life. Kofi sat on the living room floor nearby, coloring quietly, oblivious to how much the world around him had shifted in the last week. Song answered the door. A woman stood on the porch. Late 60s, silver-streaked hair pulled back loosely, a face lined by years of hiding rather than years of age. Her eyes went straight past Song, searching, until they landed on Grace standing in the hallway behind him. The woman's hand flew to her mouth. "Grace," she whispered. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. She knew that voice. She'd heard it in half-remembered dreams for 30 years, soft and low, singing lullabies she could never fully recall when she woke. "Mama?" The word came out cracked, disbelieving. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, tears spilling immediately. "I'm so sorry it took this long. I didn't know if it was safe. I didn't know if you were safe." Grace crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps and pulled her mother into her arms, both of them shaking, both of them crying too hard to speak for a long moment. If this is hitting you right now, take a second and comment where you're watching from tonight. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's find out how she survived, and why she waited so long to come home. They sat together in Halmoni's living room as the afternoon light shifted gold across the floor, and Grace's mother, who introduced herself now only as Diane, though Halmoni still called her Sunhee out of old habit, told them everything. "I ran the night they came for me," she said, hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. "I'd already sent you away to my sister in another state. I told her never to tell you where you really came from, never to let anyone connect you back to this life. I thought if I disappeared completely, if there was no trail left to follow, they'd stop looking. Eventually they did. But by then, so much time had passed. I didn't know how to come back. I didn't know if you'd even want me to." "You could have found me," Grace said, not with anger, but with an ache that had lived in her chest her whole life without a name. "I needed you." "I know," Diane said. "And I failed you in the trying to protect you. I see that now. I spent 20 years telling myself that distance was love. But love isn't supposed to feel like an empty chair at every birthday." Song, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "The men who came after you. Are they still a threat?" Diane's face tightened. "The organization that sent them collapsed years ago. Infighting mostly. But there's one man still alive from that operation. Jinho. He's the one who gave the order to eliminate me. If he ever learns I'm alive, and that I have a daughter, he'll see her as unfinished business." The room went quiet. "Then we make sure he never finds out," Song said. "Or we deal with him before he has the chance." Grace looked at him. "Deal with him how?" Song met her eyes steadily. "Carefully. Legally, if I can manage it. I have people, resources, and 20 years of information Jinho doesn't know I've been quietly gathering since the day Sunhee disappeared. I never stopped looking either. I just didn't know what I was looking for until you walked into that diner wearing her necklace." Something eased in Grace's chest hearing that, an old ache finally finding a place to rest. Comment below. Do you think Jinho already knows Diane is alive? Or is this family finally about to get the peace they've been fighting for? Let's find out together. 2 weeks passed in a strange, tender kind of calm. Grace kept her job at Rosalie's, refusing to let money change who she was, though she let Song quietly help with Kofi's ongoing medical care without the same resistance as before. Diane moved into a small apartment nearby, close enough to be part of Kofi's life for the first time, close enough to slowly, carefully rebuild what 20 years had taken from them. Then one evening, Song called Grace with news. "Jinho's been arrested," he said. "Financial crimes, mostly, things that had nothing to do with your mother. But it means he's out of the picture for a long time. My lawyers are already working to make sure it stays that way." Grace sat down slowly on her couch, relief washing over her so completely her hands shook. "It's really over?" "It's really over," Song said. Then, quieter, "Grace, there's something else I want to ask you. Not about the danger. About us." "Okay," she said softly. "I know this started strangely," he said. "A necklace, a stranger's grief, a connection neither of us understood at first. But somewhere along the way, it became something else to me. You became someone I looked forward to seeing every single day. And I'd like the chance to see where that goes, if you'll let me." Grace smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile she'd given him since the day they met. "I think," she said, "I'd like that too." 6 months later, Rosalie's diner hosted an unusual celebration. Halmoni sat in the best booth, wrapped in a warm shawl, beaming as she watched Kofi run between tables, fully recovered, laughing freely for the first time in longer than Grace could remember. Diane sat beside her, the two women who had once been strangers bound only by loss now sharing recipes and old stories like they'd known each other for years. Miss Odessa refused to let anyone else pour the coffee, insisting this particular day called for her personal touch. And Song stood near the door, watching Grace move through the diner she'd worked in for a decade, the same worn booths, the same cracked vinyl seats, except now everything about it felt different, lighter, like a place where the past had finally stopped haunting the present. What this story taught Grace, and what it taught everyone who loved her, was that the truth doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it walks in wearing a black suit and sits in a corner booth, waiting patiently for a stranger to notice a necklace it shouldn't recognize. Sometimes love isn't lost, only hidden, waiting 20 years for the right door to finally open. And sometimes the family we spend our whole lives searching for has been searching for us just as hard, all along. What do you think was the most powerful moment in this story? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I'd love to know which part moved you the most. If this story touched your heart tonight, there's another one waiting for you on this channel that I promise will hit just as deep. Go watch it next, and I'll see you there.